Nike wasn't prepared for this. In 48 hours, a single jersey transformed into a cultural phenomenon that shattered every expectation the industry had set. But this isn't just about merchandise flying off shelves. This is about a player who spent an entire year waiting, calculating, and preparing for one moment, and when it arrived, everything exploded at once. Shedeur Sanders didn't become a household name because of his draft position. He wasn't a top pick. He wasn't handed anything on a silver platter. He was a fifth-round selection in a league that forgets about players chosen that late almost immediately. Yet somehow, this rookie managed to outsell his peers, capture fan loyalty that transcends statistics, and trigger a supply chain crisis at the world's biggest sportswear company. The story isn't about winning games or throwing touchdowns. It's about identity, patience, and understanding that sometimes the most powerful moves happen in silence. This is the untold story of how one number, one player, and one deliberate strategy created a moment that changed everything. And it all started with a choice he didn't get to make. Something unprecedented was happening in the sports merchandise world, and nobody saw it coming with full clarity until it was already too late to catch up. When Shedeur Sanders posted a single image on X, just the number 2, the internet didn't slowly react. It didn't build gradually over days or weeks. The response was instantaneous, volcanic, and completely overwhelming the systems that were supposed to handle demand of this magnitude. Within hours, jersey websites started experiencing traffic surges that broke their normal capacity. Retailers found themselves in a scramble they hadn't anticipated. And Nike, the company that handles every single official NFL jersey sale in existence, suddenly realized they were facing something far beyond routine demand. The numbers tell the story with brutal honesty. In the span of just 48 hours, Shedeur Sanders' number 2 Cleveland Browns jersey became the fastest-selling rookie jersey in recorded history. Not just fast, fastest. The previous records that had stood for years were shattered without hesitation. Analysts who track these trends couldn't believe what the data was showing them. A fifth-round draft pick, a player selected 144 overall, a rookie who had spent his first season wearing a completely different number. This was the player driving sales records that top 10 picks couldn't achieve. This was the kid breaking benchmarks that generational talents had set. The viral moment rippled across social media like nothing the industry had witnessed before. TikTok users coordinated efforts, spreading the message that Shedeur's jersey represented something bigger than just supporting a team. Fans were talking about the narrative. They were talking about a young man who could have complained, could have demanded a trade, could have made noise about being forced into number 12 when his identity was so deeply tied to number 2. Instead, he stayed silent and let his game speak. When that silence finally broke, when he reclaimed what had always been his, the world paid attention in a way that no marketing campaign could manufacture. What made this phenomenon even more shocking was the contrast between his on-field performance and his off-field influence. During his rookie season, Shedeur threw 10 interceptions. He started 7 games on a team that finished 5-12 overall. His record as a starter was 3-4. Critics had plenty of ammunition. They questioned his arm strength. They doubted his decision-making. They pointed to the numbers as evidence that the hype around him was overblown. Yet simultaneously, while these criticisms were still fresh, jersey sales were climbing. Merchandise demand was rising. Fans weren't waiting to see if he'd have a Hall of Fame career before they invested in his brand. This disconnect fascinated observers across every platform. Sports analysts who spent years understanding market trends found themselves trying to explain something that didn't fit the traditional formula. Usually, jersey sales correlate directly with on-field success. Win games, sell jerseys. Rack up statistics, move merchandise. But Shedeur was flipping the script. He was selling jerseys based on identity, narrative, and something deeper than statistics could measure. He was selling a story that fans wanted to be part of. He was selling the idea that this young man had a plan, that he was building something intentional, and that wearing his number meant you were part of that journey. The Cleveland Browns organization recognized what was happening. They weren't just observing from the sidelines. They understood that Shedeur's influence was becoming a massive asset to the franchise. A team that had struggled for decades, that had endured countless disappointments and false starts, suddenly had a player whose appeal transcended winning. The Browns could market this. They could build around this moment. Even if the on-field results weren't elite yet, The commercial potential was astronomical. Nike could see it too. The data streaming through their systems told a story of demand unlike anything they'd experienced. What elevated this moment beyond typical rookie hype was the intentionality behind it. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't a player who suddenly got famous because of a viral highlight or a surprise breakout performance. This was someone who had spent years crafting his brand around that number. From high school in Texas, through his time at Jackson State, during his career at Colorado, the number 2 had been his signature. It was woven into his identity so deeply that when he finally reclaimed it after being forced into 12, the reclamation felt like destiny. It felt inevitable, and fans responded to that energy with unprecedented urgency. The 48-hour sales record became the symbol of something larger happening in sports culture. Young athletes were learning to build personal brands that existed independently of team logos or winning percentages. Shedeur was at the forefront of that movement. He understood that in a digital age, where athletes control their own narratives through social media, where fans can support personalities independent of traditional metrics, the game had changed fundamentally. You could be a 5th-round pick. You could have a rough rookie season. You could face adversity and criticism. But if you built your brand correctly, if you understood who you were and what you represented, the market would respond. And oh, did it ever respond to Shedeur Sanders? The story actually begins months earlier, on draft day, when the Cleveland Browns made their selection official. Shedeur Sanders' name was called in the 5th round, and the reaction was mixed. Some celebrated the pick. Others questioned why a player with his profile dropped so far. Questions about arm talent, questions about his ability to elevate receivers, questions about whether he could handle pressure. The doubters existed. They were loud. But Shedeur had trained his entire life to expect exactly this. His father, Deion Sanders, had prepared him for moments like these. When Shedeur arrived in Cleveland, ready to begin his NFL career, he learned quickly that his path wouldn't include the number 2. DeAndre Carter, a seasoned wide receiver, had already claimed it. In most organizations, this would be a minor administrative detail. Find another number, move forward. But for Shedeur, this wasn't administrative. This was personal. The number 2 wasn't just a jersey number. It was his identity. It was what he'd built his entire brand around. High school friends, college teammates, fans from his past, they all associated him with that number. It was his signature. It was his mark. And suddenly, it was unavailable. The atmosphere around this situation was tense. Those closest to Shedeur expressed their frustration. His inner circle felt that an injustice had occurred. There were murmurs about pushing the issue, about making noise, about demanding that Carter surrender the number. In any other scenario, with any other player, that's probably what would have happened. Rookies have held out over numbers. Veterans have created friction over jersey assignments. Players have let their frustration be known publicly, creating drama that bounces across sports media for weeks. The playbook for handling this situation existed, and it involved making problems known. But Shedeur didn't follow that playbook. He didn't complain publicly. He didn't leak frustration to reporters. He didn't post cryptic messages on social media suggesting he'd been wronged. Instead, he did something completely different. He accepted number 12 and moved forward. He accepted a number that held no special significance to him, that didn't represent his brand, that wasn't part of his identity. He took it, and he prepared to work. This choice revealed everything about his mentality and how deeply his father's influence had shaped him. Deion Sanders had been explicit in his teachings. Eliminate excuses. Cut out distractions. Focus solely on the task at hand. Don't squabble over symbols when you've got work to do. Don't waste energy fighting battles that don't impact your preparation. The field is where you prove yourself. The field is where you show your character. Everything else is noise. So Shedeur internalized that message. He put on number 12, a number that meant nothing to him, and he decided to make it mean something through his performance. This was the strategy. This was the approach that would separate him from typical players who got caught up in the emotions of situations like these. What made this even more impressive was understanding the context of his life. Shedeur had been in the spotlight since childhood. His father is Deion Sanders, an all-time great, a Pro Football Hall of Famer, a man whose presence dominates any room he enters. Growing up as the son of prime time meant living in a fishbowl. Everyone had opinions about Shedeur. Everyone expected him to be a certain way, to achieve certain things, to carry on a certain legacy. The pressure was immense. At Jackson State, where his father was the head coach, that pressure intensified. Every decision was scrutinized. Every throw was analyzed. Every moment was magnified because of who his father was. So when number 2 was taken from him, when the thing he'd built his identity around was suddenly unavailable, the test wasn't about the number itself. It was about whether he'd crack under pressure. It was about whether he'd respond emotionally or respond with discipline. It was about whether he understood that his worth wasn't tied to a jersey number. Shedeur chose discipline. He chose the path that his father had taught him to walk. And in doing so, he set himself apart from the player he could have become, the one who complained, the one who made demands, the one who let frustration drive his narrative. This silence wasn't weakness. This calm wasn't acceptance of injustice. This was calculated patience. This was understanding that if he performed well in number 12, if he proved his worth wearing something that wasn't his, then when the opportunity came to reclaim what was his, the reclamation would mean something. The narrative would be complete. The arc would be perfect. He would have demonstrated that his value existed independent of symbols, independent of jersey numbers, independent of anything external. And then, when he finally got his number back, the impact would be multiplied by everything that came before it. His teammates saw this. His coaches recognized it. And slowly, the fanbase began to understand that they were watching something different. They were watching a player who had been taught to embrace adversity as opportunity. They were watching a rookie navigate the most difficult aspects of professional football, expectations, disappointment, forced compromise, with a maturity that was rare. And that understanding would become crucial when everything finally changed. The weeks turned into months, and Shedeur Sanders settled into his role as the Cleveland Browns' starting quarterback wearing number 12. Every game was an opportunity to prove something. Not to the doubters, though he was proving something to them too. Not to the critics, though they were being proven wrong week after week. He was proving something to himself. He was testing the limits of his discipline. He was seeing how far he could push past the initial disappointment of not having his number and still perform at a high level. 7 starts came during his rookie season. 7 opportunities to show the NFL what he was capable of. And in each game, something became evident. This kid had arm talent. This kid could make throws that surprised experienced analysts. This kid possessed a calmness in the pocket that shouldn't have existed in a 5th-round pick on a struggling team. Over 1,400 passing yards accumulated across those starts. Not elite numbers, but solid numbers. Respectable numbers from a rookie who was thrown into situations that would have broken many players. The offensive line in Cleveland was struggling. The receiving core was limited. The supporting cast around Shedeur was far from ideal. Every advantage a young quarterback needs to develop successfully was missing. Yet he still found ways to execute. He still found ways to make plays. He still found ways to stay composed even when the protection broke down and defenders were in his face. This was the silent strategy proving itself. He wasn't complaining about his circumstances. He wasn't pointing to the lack of resources as excuses. He was working with what he had and improving incrementally. 10 interceptions came too. Critics seized on those numbers immediately. They pointed to the interceptions as evidence that the hype was overblown. They questioned his decision-making under pressure. They suggested that his success in college hadn't translated to the professional level. These criticisms stung, probably. They were legitimate in some ways. A 5th-round pick throwing 10 interceptions in 7 starts would typically be heading toward the bench or the practice squad in most organizations. The conventional wisdom said Shedeur should be worried about his future in the league. But something was happening simultaneously that the critics weren't accounting for. The fans were watching differently. They were seeing past the interceptions. They were recognizing that this young man was operating in circumstances that would have derailed most rookies. They were seeing his maturity. They were seeing his refusal to make excuses. They were seeing the discipline that his father had instilled in him manifesting on the field week after week. And most importantly, they were seeing someone who was building something intentional, something that would outlast a single season or a single statistical line. The silence throughout this process was deafening in its own way. Shedeur didn't post about wanting his number back. He didn't leak frustrations to the media. He didn't create drama around his circumstances. He simply played football and prepared for the moment when his opportunity would come. His father had taught him the power of silence. In a league where everyone talks constantly, where every emotion is broadcast immediately, Where narratives are built on what players say in interviews and on social media, silence becomes a weapon. Silence suggests confidence. Silence suggests you're focused on things bigger than the noise. Silence suggests patience. Around him, the fanbase was quietly building something too. They were beginning to understand Shedeur's story in a deeper way. They recognized that he wasn't a typical fifth-round pick-chasing desperation. He was someone with a plan. He was someone who understood that his narrative arc was longer than one season. He was someone who was willing to trust the process and wait for the moment when everything aligned. And that understanding created a loyalty that transcended statistics. Fans weren't rooting for Shedeur because he had the best numbers. They were rooting for him because they believed in what he was building. The strategy of silence also protected him from a trap that many young players fall into. If Shedeur had complained about the number situation, if he had made it public, if he had created friction around it, he would have become defined by that conflict. Reporters would have asked about it constantly. Every interview would have circled back to the number 2 situation. The narrative would have shifted from young quarterback proving himself to young quarterback fighting for his number. By staying silent, by not feeding the drama, he maintained control of his own story. And there was another layer to this strategic silence. It was respect for DeAndre Carter. The veteran wide receiver had a right to wear whatever number he'd earned. Making a public fuss about it would have created unnecessary tension in the locker room. It would have painted Shedeur as selfish, as someone putting personal interests ahead of team interests. By accepting the situation gracefully, by proving himself in number 12, Shedeur was showing maturity that resonated with his teammates, his coaches, and ultimately the organization. The weeks became a test of character that few were consciously aware was happening. Every game in number 12 was a silent declaration. Every completion was a statement. Every moment of composure under pressure was Shedeur proving that his value didn't depend on external symbols. He was proving that he had the mental fortitude to handle adversity. He was proving that his discipline was stronger than his frustration. And he was doing it all without saying a word. This was Deion Sanders' legacy being passed down in real time. This was the training of a father shaping the character of a son in a way that would eventually change everything. The Cleveland Browns finished the 2025 season with a record of 5 wins and 12 losses. It wasn't a good season. It wasn't close to playoff contention. It wasn't the kind of year that generates excitement or hope for the future. The team had significant problems across every level of the roster. The offensive line was struggling. The defense wasn't getting stops when it mattered. The wide receiver group couldn't create consistent separation. In almost every measurable way, the Browns were a below-average NFL team, and that reality directly impacted Shedeur's individual statistics. But something unexpected was happening beneath the surface of those disappointing results. While the team was losing games, while the offense was struggling to consistently move the ball, while critics were pointing to Shedeur's interception numbers as proof that he wasn't ready for the NFL, something else was being noticed. The fanbase was beginning to see something different. They were beginning to recognize that this rookie had potential that transcended the immediate circumstances around him. They were beginning to understand that he was functioning at a higher level than his statistics might suggest. Then came Pro Bowl voting, and everything shifted. The announcement came that Shedeur Sanders, a 5th-round pick on a 5-12 team, had been selected to the Pro Bowl, not as an alternate, not as a long shot, but as an actual selection. The fans had voted. The players had voted. And collectively, they had decided that despite the team's struggles, despite the interceptions, despite all the reasons to doubt him, Shedeur had done something remarkable. He had earned their respect. He had earned their votes. He had earned recognition at the highest level of the sport during his first NFL season. This was historic. The last Cleveland Browns quarterback to be selected to the Pro Bowl was Derek Anderson in 2007. 2007. Almost 20 years had passed since a Browns quarterback had achieved that level of recognition. The drought was finally over, and it was ending with a 5th-round rookie wearing number 12 on a losing team. The symbolism was massive. The implications were enormous. This wasn't just an individual achievement. This was evidence of a changing narrative around Shedeur Sanders. The Pro Bowl selection changed how people talked about Shedeur. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't primarily about whether he was an NFL-caliber quarterback. That question had been answered by the fans and players who voted for him. Now the conversation was shifting toward bigger questions. What did this mean for his future? What could he accomplish if he had better talent around him? What would his trajectory look like if the team improved? The questions became about potential and ceiling, not about baseline competence. Critics who had been pointing to his struggles now had to acknowledge this achievement. They couldn't simply dismiss him as a failed fifth-round pick anymore. The Pro Bowl selection was irrefutable evidence that something special was happening. Even with all the handicaps, even with an inferior supporting cast, even with a losing team, Shedeur had impressed the people who mattered most, the other players in the league and the fans who watched every week. That said something fundamental about his abilities. What made this moment even more significant was the contrast it created with his statistical line. Most Pro Bowl selections come from players who put up elite numbers. Their quarterbacks throwing 40 touchdowns. Their running backs rushing for 1,500 yards. Their receivers catching 150 passes. But Shedeur's Pro Bowl selection came despite putting up ordinary numbers in most statistical categories. It came because of something intangible. It came because of the way he carried himself. It came because of the maturity he displayed. It came because of the belief that he was building something that would prove itself over time. The timing of this selection was crucial. It came right in the middle of the season when things were still uncertain. It came when Shedeur was still wearing number 12, still dealing with the disappointment of not having his actual number. It came when the team was struggling and the future looked uncertain. And somehow, despite all of that, he was being recognized as one of the best at his position in the entire league. That recognition wasn't based on external circumstances. It wasn't based on winning. It was based on who he was as a player and a person. For Shedeur, the Pro Bowl selection validated the strategy of silence. It proved that if you focus on your work, if you don't complain about circumstances, if you stay disciplined and composed, the market recognizes it. The people in the sport recognize it. The voters recognize it. His peers recognize it. All the doubt and criticism and questioning became irrelevant when measured against the affirmation of a Pro Bowl selection from the people who knew the game best. The selection also created anticipation. If Shedeur could achieve this level of recognition while wearing the wrong number, while playing on a losing team, while dealing with subpar circumstances, what could he accomplish when everything aligned? What would happen when he reclaimed his number? What would happen when the team improved around him? What would happen when he didn't have to overcome the handicaps that had defined his rookie season? These questions hung in the air as the season concluded. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, but the Pro Bowl selection had set the stage for something monumental to occur. Long before Shedeur Sanders put on an NFL uniform, long before the Cleveland Browns drafted him, long before any of the drama with DeAndre Carter and number 12, he had already decided who he was going to be. The number 2 wasn't arbitrary. It wasn't a random choice. It was intentional. It was deliberate. It was the foundation of a personal brand that he had been constructing since his high school days in Texas. From the earliest stages of his athletic career, Shedeur understood something that many players never figure out until much later, if they figure it out at all. He understood that in modern sports, your individual brand matters. Your identity matters. The way people perceive you independent of team affiliation matters. He understood that in an age where athletes control their own narratives through social media, where fans can follow personalities independent of franchises, where personal brands can generate income and influence independent of team success, you need to build something that belongs entirely to you. So he chose number 2, and he built his entire public persona around it. He made it his signature. He connected it to everything he did. When people thought of Shedeur Sanders, they thought of the number 2. When they saw the number 2, they thought of Shedeur Sanders. The association was intentional. It was calculated. It was part of a larger strategy to create a recognizable personal brand that would transcend team changes, coaching changes, and the unpredictability of professional sports. At Jackson State, playing for his father, Shedeur wore the number 2. He built his college career around it. He created highlights wearing it. He made memories wearing it. The number became inseparable from his identity during those years. When he moved to Colorado, he carried that brand with him. He continued to wear the number 2. He continued to build his legend around it. Fans in Boulder recognized him by that number. The media called him by the number 2. His social media presence was built around the number 2. He was constructing something intentional, something that would belong to him regardless of where he played or who he played for. This is where Shedeur differentiated himself from other young athletes. Most rookies show up to the NFL and adapt to whatever number is available. They accept assignments and move forward. But Shedeur had already spent years building an identity around his number. He had already invested in a personal brand that existed independently of any team. This wasn't just about vanity or preference. It was about understanding that his value as a brand ambassador, as a personality, as someone who could generate merchandise sales and endorsement deals, was tied directly to that number and the identity he'd built around it. Before he ever stepped onto an NFL field, Shedeur had merchandise associated with the number 2. He had his own line of apparel. He had clothing designed around his number. He had built distribution channels and business relationships that existed independent of the NFL. He understood that if he was going to maximize his earning potential, if he was going to build a brand that could compete with the biggest names in the sport, he needed to own something that was entirely his. That something was the number 2. This business acumen, this understanding of personal branding in the modern era, this vision of building something beyond football, came from his environment. Growing up around his father, Deion Sanders, meant growing up around someone who understood celebrity, who understood brand building, who understood how to leverage your name and your image into something bigger than the sport itself. Deion had done it masterfully. He had created a personal brand that had outlasted his playing career. He had built a presence in entertainment, in media, in business ventures that extended far beyond football. Shedeur was taking those lessons and applying them to his own career. So when he arrived in Cleveland and found that number 2 was unavailable, the frustration wasn't just about a jersey assignment. It was about a threat to a brand he'd spent years building. It was about external circumstances jeopardizing something he'd intentionally constructed. But here's where the maturity showed again. Rather than panic about the brand disruption, rather than fight to keep something that was temporarily out of reach, Shedeur understood that brands are flexible. Brands can adapt. Brands can evolve. What matters is the person behind the brand. So he wore number 12 and continued to build his brand through his performance, through his presence, through his character. The number changed, but the identity remained intact. He was still Shedeur Sanders. He still carried the same values. He still represented the same qualities. And slowly, something interesting happened. Fans began to separate the person from the number. They understood that his appeal wasn't dependent on a jersey number. His appeal was dependent on who he was. This actually strengthened his brand in ways that couldn't have happened if he'd gotten his number immediately. By proving that his value transcended the number, by showing that he could build momentum and create enthusiasm even while wearing something that wasn't his signature, Shedeur demonstrated something crucial. He demonstrated that his brand was about him, not about symbols. And when he finally reclaimed the number 2, when everything aligned, the impact would be multiplied because it would represent the completion of something intentional, not just the acquisition of a number. The merchandise lines, the business relationships, the infrastructure he'd built around the number 2, it all remained in place during his rookie season. It was waiting. It was ready. The moment the number became available again, everything was positioned to capitalize on it. This wasn't luck. This wasn't accident. This was strategy. This was the result of a young man understanding personal branding at a level that most players never reach, and having the discipline to execute that strategy even when circumstances made it difficult. March 30th, 2026 arrived like any other day, but something shifted in the atmosphere. DeAndre Carter had departed from the Cleveland Browns. The wide receiver who had held the number 2 for Shedeur's entire rookie season was gone. And just like that, the number 2 was available. It was sitting there, unclaimed, waiting for someone to step into it. Everyone knew exactly who that someone would be. The moment had finally arrived. The Cleveland Browns didn't hesitate. They didn't deliberate. They didn't create drama or suspense. The organization moved swiftly and announced the news to the world. Shedeur Sanders was reclaiming his number. For the 2026 season, he would be wearing number 2. The number that had been taken from him, the number that represented his identity, the number that he'd waited an entire season to get back. The announcement was official, confirmed, and irreversible. The response was immediate. News outlets picked it up. Social media erupted. Fans who had been waiting for this moment suddenly felt the electricity. This was happening. This was real. The thing that had seemed inevitable but uncertain for months was now confirmed. But the way Shedeur chose to announce it to his own followers, to the people who had supported him throughout his rookie season, was characteristic of everything about him. He posted on X not a long statement, not a detailed explanation, not a philosophical reflection on reclaiming what was his. He posted a single image, the number 2, just the number, nothing else. Silence speaks volumes, just 2. That was all. That was everything. 4 words and an image that said more than any press conference ever could. The simplicity of the announcement was stunning. In a world where athletes issue lengthy statements where they explain their emotions and their journey and their gratitude for supporters, Shedeur chose silence. He chose to let the image speak for itself. He chose to let the number represent everything that needed to be said. And the internet lost its mind. The post exploded across platforms. It was retweeted millions of times. It was analyzed from every angle. People who weren't even football fans were commenting on the elegance of the announcement. Athletes from other sports took note of how it was done. The media couldn't stop talking about it. A single image and 4 words had generated more conversation than any traditional announcement could have. This was the power of understanding your audience, understanding your narrative, and executing with precision. What happened next was chaos, but the good kind. The kind that retailers dream about. The kind that Nike had probably prepared for but couldn't have fully anticipated. Fans who had been waiting rushed to their devices. They had been preparing for this moment. They had been ready. The moment the announcement dropped, the moment the number was confirmed, they pounced. Shopping carts filled up instantly. Checkout pages loaded. Credit cards were ready. The customers who had spent an entire season wearing number 12, the fans who had invested in him during his rookie year, suddenly had the option to upgrade. To get the real number. To get the symbol they'd been waiting for. Customers who had already purchased number 12 jerseys started contacting retailers asking about exchanges. They wanted to switch to number 2. The urgency was real. This wasn't casual shopping. This wasn't, maybe I'll grab one eventually. This was immediate, pressing, I need this right now energy. People were flooding customer service departments. They were spamming social media asking about availability. They were camping on retail websites waiting for stock to appear. Websites that normally handled moderate traffic loads suddenly found themselves unable to cope with the surge. Loading times slowed to a crawl. Some sites crashed entirely. Retail shops reported lines of customers coming in person to try to grab jerseys. The supply chain that had been built around routine demand suddenly found itself facing something unprecedented. The synchronicity of the request was unlike anything the system had seen before. Usually, jersey demand spreads out over weeks or months. This was compressed into hours. This was concentrated, focused, overwhelming demand from a massive group of customers, all trying to acquire the same thing simultaneously. The moment was generating conversation beyond just merchandise. Analysts who track sports business were shifting their focus from football to commerce. This was a financial story. This was a case study in supply and demand. This was an example of how celebrity and personal branding could generate economic impact that transcended the actual product's practical value. These weren't just jerseys being sold. These were symbols. These were pieces of a narrative. These were investments in a story that people wanted to be part of. And through it all, Shedeur remained calm. He didn't post follow-ups. He didn't feed the frenzy with additional content. He simply existed in the moment that he'd been preparing for. The silence continued. The discipline remained. He understood that his job wasn't to amplify the moment. His job was to let the moment amplify itself, and it was doing exactly that. The power of that moment, compressed into the space of a single announcement and a few hours of immediate response, demonstrated everything about the strategy that had been building for years. A 5th-round pick, a player who wasn't supposed to matter this much, a rookie who had spent his first season proving he was more than his draft position. He had just created a moment that would be remembered. He had orchestrated a takeover that nobody could have predicted or prevented. And he had done it with nothing but an image and silence. Behind the scenes, on the operational level where strategy meets logistics, Nike was facing a situation they had prepared for in theory, but were discovering was far more intense in reality. Every single official NFL jersey sold in the United States flows through Nike's systems. Not some of them, all of them. Every order, every fan, every dollar, it all passes through their infrastructure. They are the central nervous system of the entire official NFL merchandise operation. And suddenly, that system was being tested in ways that stress-tested its very foundation. The demand surge wasn't gradual. That was the problem. If the sales had climbed steadily over days, if demand had risen in manageable increments, the system could have adapted. It could have adjusted production. It could have rerouted resources. Inventory management is about predictability. It's about understanding patterns and preparing for them. But this wasn't pattern-based demand. This was a shock to the system. This was something that arrived suddenly and overwhelmed the normal channels almost immediately. Nike's production facilities, which are among the most sophisticated in the world, suddenly found themselves in a situation where every manufacturing line needed to accelerate beyond normal capacity. The number 2 Cleveland Browns jersey in Shedeur size, in various sizes for different demographics, in different variations and editions. Suddenly, these items were the priority. Production schedules that had been planned months in advance needed to be disrupted. Materials that were supposed to be used for other products needed to be diverted. The entire supply chain, which is optimized for steady-state demand, found itself trying to respond to crisis-level surge. Materials had to be expedited. Suppliers who provide fabric, who supply the components necessary to manufacture jerseys, suddenly received urgent orders. They had to accelerate shipments. They had to prioritize Shedeur Sanders merchandise over their other commitments. The entire upstream supply chain felt the shockwave. Logistics companies that move materials between suppliers and factories suddenly had more freight to move on compressed timelines. The manufacturing process itself had to be reorganized. Quality control, which is paramount in a brand like Nike, couldn't be sacrificed even under pressure. But the pace had to increase dramatically. Workers at production facilities found themselves working overtime. Assembly lines that normally operated at a steady pace were pushed to their limits. Inspection processes had to be maintained while throughput increased exponentially. It's a difficult balance: maintain quality while increasing speed at a level that isn't normally sustainable. Once jerseys were manufactured, they had to be inspected, packaged, and dispatched. Fulfillment centers that normally operate according to established routines suddenly found themselves in controlled chaos. Pallets of jerseys needed to be sorted, processed, and shipped out as quickly as possible. Distribution networks that would normally spread shipments throughout a month needed to condense everything into days. Trucks that carry merchandise to retailers had to be allocated specifically for Shedeur Sanders jerseys. Shipping companies that contract with Nike had to prioritize their freight. The pressure wasn't just operational, it was financial. Every hour that demand sat unfulfilled was a potential lost sale. Every customer who couldn't find what they wanted was a customer who might become frustrated and move on to something else. The window of intense demand, the moment when everyone was simultaneously trying to purchase, was finite. If Nike missed that window, if they couldn't get the inventory to market while enthusiasm was at its peak, they would squander the economic opportunity. Sales that could have been realized would be lost forever. Retailers were calling constantly. They wanted to know when stock would arrive. They wanted to understand allocation. They wanted to know if they were getting sufficient quantities to meet customer demand in their stores. Nike's customer service teams were handling unprecedented volume. Their order management systems were processing transactions at rates they'd never seen before. Their communication channels were overwhelmed with urgent requests from partners who needed inventory immediately. The pressure was relentless because customers were relentless. Fans weren't going to wait patiently. They weren't going to say, "I'll check back in 2 weeks." The energy that had been built by the announcement, by the moment of reclamation, was time-sensitive. That energy would dissipate. That urgency would fade. If the jerseys weren't available when fans were in the mindset to purchase, the opportunity would be lost. Nike understood this better than anyone. They knew that demand has a lifespan. They knew that the peak moment wouldn't last forever. What elevated the pressure even further was the understanding that this was about more than just immediate sales. This was about brand positioning. This was about Nike proving that they could handle unprecedented demand. This was about demonstrating operational excellence under extreme circumstances. If they failed, if they fumbled this moment, if they couldn't get jerseys to market while demand was at its peak, it would reflect poorly on them. It would become evidence that they couldn't manage surge demand effectively. It would be used as ammunition against them in the future. But there was also opportunity in the pressure. This wasn't a moment of failure. This was a moment of validation. Nike was learning that Shedeur Sanders was generating economic value that rivaled star players with massive fan bases. A fifth-round rookie was creating demand that comparable veteran players couldn't touch. That information was valuable. That was the kind of data that shaped decisions about which athletes to invest in, which players to prioritize for marketing, which talents to bet on for the future. So Nike pushed. They accelerated. They disrupted normal operations to serve the surge. Production teams worked extra hours. Logistics networks were reconfigured. Fulfillment centers adapted their processes. Every part of the system that could be optimized for speed was optimized. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't ideal from an operational efficiency perspective, but it was necessary. And it demonstrated what one moment, one player, one perfectly timed announcement could do to the machinery of a global corporation. What was happening in those first 48 hours after the announcement wasn't just retail activity. It was a visible demonstration of a takeover, not a hostile takeover in the traditional sense, not something being forced against anyone's will. This was an organic takeover where a fifth-round rookie was systematically becoming the most discussed, most sought after, most influential player across the entire merchandise landscape. And it was happening in real time. The sales figures that started trickling in during those first hours quickly became undeniable. Retailers were reporting sell-throughs that broke their records. Online platforms were processing transactions at rates they'd never experienced. The number 2 Cleveland Browns jersey was dominating every merchandise chart. It wasn't close to the top. It wasn't competing for the top position. It was so far ahead of its competition that the gap became the story itself. What made this even more remarkable was the context. Shedeur was competing for sales against established superstars. He was competing against players who had been in the league for years, who had Super Bowl victories, who had extensive winning records, who had national television exposure week after week. Yet somehow, in his second season, in his first season actually wearing his number, he was outselling all of them. The trajectory was undeniable. The momentum was unstoppable. Social media was ablaze with the story. Hashtags related to Shedeur Sanders' jersey were trending globally. TikTok videos discussing the sales phenomenon were accumulating hundreds of millions of views. YouTube content creators were analyzing what was happening from every angle. Reddit threads were speculating about what it all meant. The moment had transcended sports and entered the realm of broader cultural phenomenon. People who had no particular interest in football were nonetheless discussing what was happening with Shedeur Sanders' jersey sales. The narrative being told online was powerful. Fans were talking about a young man who had been doubted, who had been forced into an unfair situation, who had handled adversity with discipline and maturity, and who was now being vindicated by the market itself. It was a story about justice. It was a story about a system working as it should. It was a story about talent and character ultimately being recognized. And that narrative was compelling. People wanted to participate in that story. They wanted to buy the jersey because buying it meant being part of something larger than themselves. But there was also an undercurrent of awareness about what this moment represented. Athletes and industry observers recognized that something fundamental was happening. They recognized that a fifth-round pick had just demonstrated that draft position, traditional measures of value, and the expectations of the institutional establishment didn't necessarily predict actual market value or cultural impact. They recognized that in the modern era, an athlete's ability to build a personal brand, to connect with audiences, to create narrative momentum, might matter more than traditional statistics or accolades. For Shedeur specifically, the moment was validating everything he'd done. It was proving that the silence had been strategic. It was proving that the discipline had been intentional. It was proving that the patience had been justified. He hadn't complained during his year in number 12. He hadn't made excuses about the situation. He hadn't let frustration derail his focus. And now, with a single announcement and a perfectly timed reclamation, he was demonstrating the power of that approach. But the clock was ticking. Everyone involved understood that this peak moment wouldn't last forever. The intensity of demand, the urgency, the fever pitch of enthusiasm, these things have a natural lifespan. People would eventually get their jerseys. The scarcity would resolve. The moment would settle. In a week or two, the frenzy would cool. The sales would stabilize at elevated but less frantic levels. This window of absolute peak demand, where everyone wanted everything immediately, was brief. That's what created the pressure. That's what made every hour matter. Nike understood that they needed to satisfy demand while the moment was still at its peak. Retailers understood that they needed to get inventory while fans were still in buying mode. Shedeur understood that he needed to leverage this moment for everything it was worth. The entire system understood that windows like this don't open often and don't stay open long. And yet, beneath all the urgency and the chaos and the pressure, there was something else happening. There was the dawning realization that Shedeur Sanders had arrived, not in the sense of a breakout performance or an elite statistical season, but in the sense of cultural arrival. He had announced himself as more than just another NFL player. He had demonstrated that he was something different. He was someone who could generate momentum independent of winning. He was someone whose appeal transcended the sport itself. The merchandising success was just the visible manifestation of something deeper. It was evidence of a connection that Shedeur had built with fans. It was validation of a brand that he had been constructing for years. It was proof that his strategy of building something intentional, something that belonged entirely to him, something that existed independent of team affiliation, was working exactly as he designed it. For anyone paying attention to the patterns of modern sports, for anyone understanding how the next generation of athletes were going to make their mark, Shedeur Sanders had just provided a masterclass. He had shown that patience could work. He had shown that discipline could generate more momentum than complaining ever could. He had shown that understanding personal branding, understanding your audience, understanding how to create narrative moments could elevate you beyond the traditional paths to success. The 48-hour sales record was just the beginning. The takeoff was accelerating. The momentum was building. And if Shedeur continued to perform on the field, if he continued to develop as a quarterback, if he continued to leverage his brand effectively, the best was yet to come. The takeover wasn't just about jerseys. It was about a young man proving that fifth-round picks with discipline, vision, and strategy could become something more than anyone expected. And the market was responding to that possibility with unmistakable enthusiasm. What unfolded in those 48 hours was more than merchandise flying off shelves. It was the culmination of years of intentional strategy finally reaching its moment. Shedeur Sanders proved something that the skeptics couldn't deny. A single player, operating with discipline and vision, could move markets that seemed immovable. He broke records that had stood for years. He created urgency that Nike, with all its resources and infrastructure, had to scramble to meet. But most importantly, he demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful moves happen in silence. This wasn't about luck. This wasn't about circumstance. This was about a young man who had been taught by his father that excellence is built through preparation, discipline, and patience. Deion Sanders had passed down a philosophy that transcended football, and Shedeur had applied it with precision. He wore the wrong number for a season without complaint. He performed under adverse circumstances without excuses. He waited for his moment without forcing it. And when the moment came, he seized it with a simplicity that spoke volumes. The number 2 jersey-breaking sales records is just the beginning of this story. Shedeur Sanders has announced his arrival not just as an NFL player, but as a cultural figure. The questions now aren't about whether he can make it in the league. The questions are about how high he'll climb, about what he'll build, about whether this moment of momentum will be sustained through excellence on the field. The takeover has started. Everything else is still to come. What happens next will determine whether this is a moment or the beginning of an era.